The sound of glass shattering filled the main hall of the luxurious Kingsley's restaurant, followed by a muffled cry of pain that instantly drew all eyes to table number 6, where the son of magnate Richard Montgomery, young Lucas, lay on the floor with one of his orthopedic braces broken, his fragile leg exposed, and his face contorted more with shame than with pain. The scene was brutal, not because of blood, there was none, but because of the intensity of the silence that followed, the kind of silence that weighs on the chest, laden with judgment and disbelief. And then, as if breaking the gravity of the moment, Diana Johnson, the only black waitress in that elite dining room, knelt beside the boy, holding his trembling hand, while the others merely watched like statues, immobilized by a mix of shock and embarrassment. "He just wanted to try dancing alone," Diana murmured, her voice as soft as a whisper but clear enough for Richard, the most powerful man in the room, to hear perfectly, even though he didn't yet know how to process such a simple yet profoundly unsettling act for the structure of control with which he had always managed his life and his son's. In that instant, something unexpected happened. Lucas, even with his leg immobilized, reached out toward Diana and with a faint smile asked, as if pleading for a chance to be seen as more than a broken child, "Would you dance with me?" The words seemed to ricochet off the marble-clad walls, echoing up to the mezzanine where a small string quartet paused its classical performance, as if the music itself needed to halt in the face of the audacity of that scene. The restaurant manager, Mr. Thornton, hurried across the hall, visibly more concerned with the establishment's reputation than with the boy's well-being. "Please, Mr. Montgomery, control your son. This is a restaurant, not an amusement park," he snapped stiffly, casting a glance at Diana that was less reproach and more veiled contempt. "And you step back immediately. You're not paid for this kind of spectacle." But before Richard could say anything, Diana, with the same disarming serenity of someone who had faced battles far greater than the disapproval of an arrogant manager, calmly removed her apron, folding it with surgical precision over the serving tray. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she took Lucas's hand again, looking at him with a smile no corporate protocol could replicate. "I just can't dance in an apron," she said. The magnate stood motionless. His mind seemed torn between yelling at her, pulling his son away, or simply retreating to never face the shame of that episode again. But before any thought could solidify, he saw with his own eyes Diana supporting the boy, adjusting her movements to the limited cadence Lucas's paralyzed legs could offer. It wasn't a beautiful dance, but it was a free one, and for the first time in 2 years since the accident, Richard realized his son was leading someone, even if only for 3 or 4 faltering steps. He wasn't being pushed, carried, or accommodated. He was leading. When Diana returned him to his chair under the incredulous gazes of everyone, she said, "Thank you for the invitation. It was an honor to dance with you, sir." The formality drew muffled laughs from corners of the room, but no one dared interrupt that moment, not even the all-powerful Richard Montgomery, whose expression was now a mix of astonishment and painful introspection. "What's your name?" Richard asked almost automatically, as if needing to note something before time erased it. "Diana Johnson," she replied with a slight nod. Richard pulled a business card from his jacket, handed it to her, and with the coldness years of power had sculpted into his voice, said, "My office, tomorrow, 10 in the morning." The entire restaurant held its breath. Diana took the card, and even with a slightly trembling hand, she maintained her upright posture and steady gaze. She didn't ask, "For what?" She simply nodded, as if knowing there are things that must be done, even if they aren't clear at the moment. "Dad, why did you do that?" Lucas asked as soon as Diana walked away, leaving a trail of glances and murmurs behind her. The question hung in the air, both an accusation and an invitation to reflection. Richard didn't answer. He didn't know how, or perhaps he didn't want to admit, even to himself, that for the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless in the face of something his entire financial empire couldn't buy. The spontaneity, courage, and humanity of a woman who simply accepted a boy's invitation to dance. If this story has already touched your heart, and you want to discover how a simple gesture can forever transform the lives of 3 people, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us until the end of this emotional journey, where we'll show that some of the greatest revolutions begin with a step, even a trembling one, toward the unknown. The next day, when Diana Johnson walked through the smoked glass doors of the imposing Montgomery Investments headquarters, She felt the cold air conditioning as a reminder that this environment wasn't built for people like her. The white marble, oak panels, minimalist sculptures, everything there seemed designed to intimidate, to reinforce a hierarchy as rigid as the schedules handled by the receptionists behind their gleaming counters. "Diana Johnson for Mr. Montgomery," she announced, keeping her voice steady despite the chill she felt, not from the air conditioning but from the uncertainty hanging over that meeting. The receptionist, a woman in an impeccable blazer and impassive expression, looked up, sizing her up from her cheap shoes to her simple bun, as if weighing what a woman like her could possibly want there. After a quick phone call, she nodded. "18th floor. Miss Winters will escort you." The elevator seemed to climb too slowly, the full-length mirror reflecting her image and with it, all the doubts she'd tried to suppress since the previous night, when she'd rehearsed dozens of times what she might say, what she should refuse, how to keep intact the integrity that had cost her so much to build over the years. As the doors opened, a woman in her 40s, hair tied in a severe bun and an expression that wasted no time, approached. "Miss Johnson?" she asked, and without waiting for confirmation continued, "This way." The glass-walled corridor offered a view of the sprawling city below, but Diana kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the grandeur of the architecture invade her mind. As they passed the last office, Miss Winters said without looking back, "He got you fired, didn't he?" The tone was less curious than resigned, as if she'd seen this scene play out dozens of times. Diana took a deep breath, refusing to engage in the woman's game. "My shift ended yesterday." Winters let out a humorless laugh. "People like you should know your place." Without changing her tone, Diana replied, "And where exactly would that place be?" But before Miss Winters could respond, a phone rang. "He'll see you now." The office door opened, and as she crossed the threshold, Diana felt for the second time in less than 24 hours that strange, unsettling sensation that life had staged a play she couldn't yet decipher. The office occupied nearly half the floor, with glass windows that turned Manhattan into a static, distant painting. And there, standing, gazing at the city as if it belonged to him, was Richard Montgomery. "Miss Johnson," he greeted, turning with the carefully neutral expression she'd expected to find. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Montgomery," she replied, matching his formality. "Please." He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Diana sat, crossing her legs with the quiet elegance she'd learned to cultivate in environments where she'd need to bend but never break. The silence that followed was deliberate, one of those corporate strategies designed to make the other side rush, say more than they should, succumb to anxiety. But Diana didn't yield. She simply met his gaze, patient. Finally, Richard spoke. "I'd like to know more about you." Diana raised an eyebrow, a nearly imperceptible movement. "For what reason?" "Yesterday, you did something that no one has ever managed to do with my son since the accident. He invited me to dance." Richard leaned forward slightly as if searching for a crack. "And you accepted?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because no one should reach out and be left unanswered," she said simply. Richard leaned back, as if unprepared for such a direct response. "I did some research on you." Diana wasn't surprised. "Bachelor's in Child Development from NYU, Master's in Special Education, incomplete." She nodded. "3 jobs. Waitress at Kingsley's, bookstore clerk in the Bronx, and private tutor when you find students." "Correct." Richard picked up a file from his desk and opened it. "And founder of an adaptive dance program for children with disabilities, Freedom Steps." Diana straightened her posture further. "Co-founder with my sister. A project that's about to shut down for lack of funding." She smiled, without irony. "I figured you'd know that." Richard closed the file. "Why didn't you ask me for help yesterday?" "Because I didn't come here to ask for help," she replied with the same serenity with which she'd held Lucas's hand the night before. "I came because you invited me." Richard took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "What you did yesterday was more effective than 2 years of therapies, sessions, and specialists." His voice faltered almost imperceptibly. He smiled. "He led someone. After everything, he led." "And it was just a dance," Diana added, as if emphasizing the essential simplicity of the gesture. Richard looked up at her, his eyes now less cold, but still searching to understand. "I want you to work for me." Diana couldn't hide a slight expression of surprise, but quickly composed herself. "As a waitress in your home?" Richard leaned forward. "As a therapeutic companion for Lucas." She took a deep breath. weighing every word she might say. But before she could respond, he added, "I'll pay 5 times what you earn now." The silence that followed was no longer the silence of corporate strategies, but the silence that precedes choices that shape destinies. Finally, Diana stood, picked up her purse and said, without altering her tone, "No." Richard stood abruptly, shocked, as if that word were more jarring than any insult. "Why?" he asked, unable to contain his disbelief. Diana turned to him with the same quiet dignity with which she'd left her apron on the tray at the restaurant. "Because I don't work for people who see my color or my class before they see my competence. And, more importantly, because your son doesn't need another person paid to pretend they care. He needs someone who lets him be who he is." She walked to the door, but, before leaving, turned, pulled a card from her purse, and placed it on the desk. "Freedom Steps. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 in the afternoon. If you want, bring Lucas, the first class is free." And she left. Richard stood still, staring at that small card, as if it were not just a piece of paper, but a crack that had opened for the first time in the fortress he'd built around himself. The following Tuesday afternoon, Richard Montgomery's black Bentley parked in front of the old red brick warehouse where Freedom Steps operated. The contrast couldn't have been greater. On one side, the luxury car with tinted windows and a silent engine. On the other, a weathered facade with a hand-painted sign that read, "Your rhythm, your victory." Lucas, seated in the back, eagerly watched the children outside, running with crutches, wheelchairs, or orthopedic braces, similar to his own. Richard, still behind the wheel, made no move to turn off the engine. The tension in his jaw betrayed the internal conflict he was waging, a silent clash between the arrogance that had built empires and the vulnerability that, for the first time, made him hesitate before the simplicity of a community warehouse. "He's not getting out," murmured Zoe, Diana's sister, watching the scene from inside the reception, adjusting her hijab with the same nervousness that masked her urge to run out and say something. Diana beside her smiled confidently. "He will." "You're sure?" "Don't underestimate the power of a determined child." And as if the universe decided to confirm her statement, Lucas opened the car door, slowly adjusted his orthopedic brace, and, with a resolute look, began walking toward the center's entrance. Richard, after a few seconds of paralysis, turned off the engine, let out a deep sigh, and got out of the car too, adjusting the collar of his casual sweater, a poorly disguised attempt to appear less executive and more human. "Welcome to Freedom Steps," Diana greeted as father and son crossed the threshold. She was dressed simply, with the program's logo embroidered on her chest. Her smile was warm but firm, like someone who knew this wasn't just another class but the start of a possible transformation. Lucas looked fascinated at the open space, where several children explored movements to the sound of upbeat music. There was a girl spinning her wheelchair in perfect circles, a boy with a prosthetic leg performing carefully calculated dance steps, and others simply moving freely, unconcerned with what might be considered correct. "It looks chaotic," Richard commented, crossing his arms, his gaze heavy with the skepticism of someone who always associated progress with rigidity and discipline. "It looks free," Diana corrected, looking at Lucas. "And you, Lucas, want to join in?" The boy nodded, but his gaze hesitated, seeking his father's approval. Richard looked at Diana, then at his son, and then, with effort, said, "Go ahead, I'll be right here." Lucas smiled and, with slow, clumsy steps, began mingling with the other children. While Diana guided the boy, Zoe approached Richard and gestured to a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she remarked. "For them?" Richard asked, still unable to relax. "For the parents." Richard forced a smile but lost it upon realizing Zoe spoke with the ease of someone who'd witnessed this scene dozens of times. "He already has therapists, physiotherapists, specialists," Richard began, as if justifying his presence there. "And how's that working out?" Zoe asked, cutting to the chase. Richard didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His gaze, now fixed on Lucas, said more than any words could. Suddenly the warehouse door opened again, and an older woman with elegantly braided grey hair and an ornate cane entered the space with quiet authority. The children smiled upon seeing her, and some waved. "Dr. Elaine Mercer," Zoe whispered to Richard. "Neuroscientist, retired from Harvard. She oversees the research side of the program." Richard's eyes widened. "Dr. Mercer, I rejected her project 3 times. "I know," Zoe replied, not hiding a slight tone of irony. Dr. Mercer walked over to a group of children, spoke briefly, and then noticed Richard seated in the corner. "Mr. Montgomery?" she greeted, approaching with a polite smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," he replied, unsure how to act in front of the woman whose proposals he'd systematically dismissed. "You rejected our project 3 times, if I'm not mistaken," she remarked without bitterness, just with the precision of someone well versed in the facts. "Yes, I thought it was too much idealism, too little science." She smiled, her eyes gleaming with a mix of compassion and challenge. "And now, do you see the idealism or the science?" Richard didn't know how to respond immediately. He watched Lucas, who at that moment was trying to follow a sequence of movements alongside another child, his eyes shining with the thrill of autonomy. "I thought this was just a dance class," Richard murmured. "It's a living laboratory, Mr. Montgomery. We're testing how non-directive approaches can stimulate neural plasticity in children with motor challenges." "Neuroscience in a community warehouse?" Richard asked with a half-smile. "With better results than many elite labs," Dr. Mercer replied. Diana, now returning after positioning Lucas in an activity, joined the conversation. "You knew who I was from the start, didn't you?" Richard asked, looking between Diana and Mercer. Diana nodded without any embarrassment. "From the moment you walked into the restaurant." "And yet," he began but couldn't finish. "And yet when Lucas invited me to dance, I just did what I always do. I accepted." Dr. Mercer smiled, satisfied, as if watching the pieces of a puzzle come together in the man's mind before her. Suddenly, a group of photographers entered through the side of the warehouse. Richard tensed, his eyes narrowing as if sensing an ambush. "What's this?" he asked. Zoe beside him explained, "We published an article today about the program's preliminary results. We invited the press." Richard turned to Diana, whose expression remained serene. "You used my son for a marketing stunt," he accused, his tone rising. Diana took a deep breath and said, "No, your son used the opportunity he was given. We just did our job. We created the space." Richard fell silent, and then, almost in a whisper, asked, "Was it all staged?" Diana looked him in the eye, firm. "Not Lucas's invitation, not my yes, but when I saw you there, I saw a chance to show, not explain." At that moment, applause echoed through the warehouse. Richard turned and saw Lucas in the middle of the group, without one of his braces, balancing on just one leg and trying to stay steady. "Lucas." He began to stand, but Diana held his arm. "Wait." And then, before everyone, with cameras and phones capturing the moment, Lucas took a step. Small, faltering, but unsupported. Richard sank back into his chair, his eyes welling up for the first time in years. "And that's why Freedom Steps exists," Diana said softly. "Not for perfection, but for first steps." The silence that filled the warehouse after Lucas's small but monumental step was not the same awkward silence from the restaurant days earlier. It was a reverent silence, full of respect and admiration, as if everyone there instinctively understood the significance of what they'd witnessed. Not just a physical advance, but the breaking of an invisible prison that limited Lucas far beyond his legs. The children applauded spontaneously, celebrating as only children can, with genuine smiles and bright eyes. The photographers and journalists moved quickly, capturing angles, smiles, and tears. Richard, however, remained seated, motionless, as if for the first time in years accepting he wasn't the center, the commander, the undisputed leader of the scene. Diana approached him again, but without the defiant expression from before. Now there was only empathy. "He doesn't need more specialists, Mr. Montgomery. He needs space, permission." Richard ran his hands over his face, as if trying to dispel a fog that had long clouded his eyes. This wasn't in the medical report," he stammered, more to himself than to her. "Because no report includes what happens when a child decides they want to walk on their own," Diana replied gently. Lucas, still in the center of the warehouse, was now chatting animatedly with other children, testing small movements under the attentive but non-interventionist gazes of the instructors. Richard watched him as if seeing him for the first time, not as a patient, a problem to be solved, but as a complete human being with his own desires and fears. Suddenly, Dr. Mercer's firm voice sounded behind them. "He's not a case, Mr. Montgomery. He's a person." Richard turned to face her but found no challenge in her gaze, only an invitation. "Why didn't you ever respond to our emails?" Dr. Mercer asked, without resentment, but with disarming frankness. Richard took a deep breath. knowing that in that environment rehearsed corporate responses wouldn't suffice. "Because," he began, but the truth felt too heavy. "Because I didn't believe." "Didn't believe in what?" she pressed. "In the power of vulnerability," he confessed finally, surprising even himself. Diana nodded slightly, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "But you believed in the power of control, didn't you?" she asked, not accusingly, just stating. Richard didn't respond, but his silence at that moment was the most eloquent admission. Before the conversation could continue, Zoe appeared beside them, holding a tablet. "The press wants a statement from you, Mr. Montgomery." Richard frowned, annoyed. "Now? Now? Or they'll publish just images and speculation." He looked at Lucas again, who was now laughing, balancing with difficulty, but visibly happy. I didn't come prepared for this," he stammered. Diana placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe for the first time you don't need to be prepared. You just need to be honest." Those words hit Richard harder than any market report, audit, or risk analysis. Honesty was a territory he barely knew. Minutes later, standing before a group of reporters, cameras, and raised microphones, Richard Montgomery took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and surprised everyone by dismissing the aide already positioning himself at his side. "I'll speak alone," he said firmly. The murmurs ceased immediately. "Mr. Montgomery," a journalist began, "is it true that your foundation refused to fund this program 3 times? Richard looked directly at her, then at the rest of the group, and finally at Lucas, who, noticing his father speaking, stopped playing and watched curiously. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. The murmur of surprise was immediate. "And why are you here today?" another reporter asked. Richard took another deep breath and, with a raw honesty he rarely allowed himself, said, "Because I learned the hard way that no matter how much money or power you have, some of the most important things in life can't be bought, only lived." The cameras kept capturing every expression, every nuance of this man known until then only for his financial empire and the coldness of his decisions. "My son," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "taught me more this past week than any board of directors I've ever chaired. And this woman," he said, pointing to Diana, who discreetly watched the scene a few meters away, "showed that true leadership sometimes isn't about leading but having the courage to follow." Flashes erupted. Journalists scribbled furiously. "For that reason," Richard continued, "the Montgomery Foundation commits to fully funding Freedom Steps for the next 5 years and to building, based on this methodology, a permanent center for pediatric rehabilitation." More flashes, more murmurs. "With one condition," he added, raising his hand to silence the growing excitement. The journalists leaned forward, eager. "That Diana Johnson maintains full autonomy over the program without any corporate interference." The room erupted in spontaneous applause. From the children, the parents present, the instructors, even some reporters who, for a moment, forgot journalistic impartiality. Diana stood frozen, Richard's words still echoing in her mind like an impossible reverberation. He then turned and walked straight to her. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said with a half smile. Diana took a second to respond. "Only the right boundaries." And for the first time since they'd met, both laughed. Not defensively, not as if measuring strength, but as accomplices in something they knew was bigger than them. That night, as the warehouse lights went out one by one and Freedom Steps fell silent after a memorable day, Richard sat beside Lucas in the back of the Bentley. "Are you happy?" he asked his son. Lucas smiled, tired but joyful. "Very." And then, as if realizing something he couldn't previously name, Richard asked, "Do you want to go back?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "Yes, every week." And in that moment, Richard realized that, no matter what he said or did from then on, that space, with its peeling walls and worn floor, would be more important to his son's life than any doctor's office, elite school, or multi-million-dollar investment he'd ever made. And for the first time, Richard Montgomery accepted, without resistance, to follow the path his son had chosen to walk. 3 months after that pivotal day, construction for the new Freedom Steps Center was in full swing. The chosen site, in the same neighborhood as the old warehouse, was larger, allowing the dream once whispered within the worn walls of the original space to become a concrete, expansive, and innovative project. Excavators moved slowly under Diana's watchful eye as she oversaw every stage of the construction, not as a guest, but as the rightful visionary of that center of rehabilitation and freedom. And she wasn't alone. Lucas, now free of the orthopedic brace on one leg and using only a light splint on the other, insisted on visiting the site whenever he could. He watched the workers, asked questions, and often drew attention by practicing small dance steps on the still dusty ground, eliciting smiles from workers more accustomed to hammers and concrete than the delicacy of childhood achievements. "He's doing really well," Zoe commented, approaching Diana as they watched the boy help one of the engineers trace imaginary lines with his finger on a wooden plank. "More than well," Diana replied, unable to hide her pride. "He's transforming." And as if guessing they were talking about him, Lucas shouted from afar, "Diana, Aunt Zoe, come see what Mr. Ramirez taught me to do." The two walked over, where one of the workers smiled patiently, holding a tape measure and teaching Lucas to measure distances with precision. "He's got a knack for it," Mr. Ramirez said, as Lucas focused, checked the number on the tape. "And he doesn't give up until he gets it right." Diana smiled, lightly touching the boy's shoulder. "That's our Lucas." Across the site, Richard Montgomery watched everything in silence. He wore jeans and a rolled-up dress shirt, an attempt to blend into this less formal, more human environment, an attempt that, for him, had stopped being effort and was becoming habit. "You've really become a regular, huh?" Diana commented, approaching with an ironic smile. Richard smiled too, something that until recently would have been unthinkable in such a setting. "I'm starting to think I've become a partner, even without signing anything." "You signed, yes," Diana corrected, pointing to the funding contract that formalized the new center's construction. "But that's not the most important contract I signed," Richard said, with a look heavy with meaning. "No?" she asked, curious. "No. The most important was the one I signed silently, with myself, the one to learn to be quiet, to listen, to follow, to trust." Diana fell silent for a few seconds, absorbing those words. "You took your time, but you got there," she commented without irony. Richard looked at Lucas, now chatting animatedly with another group of children. "He brought me here, and you showed me I could stay." Diana crossed her arms and, looking at the horizon, remarked, "I never thought the man who looked at me with contempt in the restaurant would say something like that." "Neither did I," Richard admitted without shame. "And your team, how did they react?" Diana asked, referring to the Montgomery Foundation's board, known for being inflexible and driven solely by numbers. "As you'd expect," he replied, letting out a muffled laugh. "Some threatened to resign. Others said I was ruining my image, that it made no sense to invest millions in a program that, according to them, seemed more like a social utopia than a project with guaranteed returns." "And what did you say?" Diana wanted to know. "That there are returns that can't be measured in financial reports. Some are measured in steps taken by children who were told for years they'd never walk alone." Diana smiled, moved. "They must have been furious." "Probably still are," Richard replied, shrugging. "But for the first time, I don't care." The cool breeze of that afternoon blew lightly, making the construction site's marking flags flutter. In the distance, Manhattan's skyline seemed a far-off, almost unreal backdrop compared to the life pulsing there, in that construction site that felt more like a childhood backyard than a corporate venture. "And your life, outside of here?" Diana asked, after a few seconds of comfortable silence. Richard grew pensive. "It's changing, slowly but irreversibly." "How?" "I've started attending neuroscience classes with Dr. Mercer," he replied, with a certain pride. Diana looked at him, surprised. "Seriously?" "Yes, I've started studying neural plasticity, adaptive movements, even dance, believe it or not." Diana laughed. "You? Dance?" "I'm taking a chance," he admitted, with a smile that revealed more about his transformation than any speech could. "And why?" she wanted to know. "Because if I really want to be by my son's side, I need to truly understand his world. And that world passes through here, through you all." Diana fell silent, touched by the sincerity of that response. "And you?" Richard asked, shifting the focus. "How are you?" Diana took a deep breath, looking at the construction site, as if seeing not just the present, but all the possibilities now opening up. "I'm finally living what I always dreamed of, and with a team I never imagined having." Richard followed her gaze to Zoe, Lucas, the workers, the architects, and all the volunteers who had come together to turn that space into something that transcended the idea of a rehabilitation center. It was a symbol of resistance, hope, and future. "And to think it all started with a step," Richard commented. A step, a dance, and a choice, Diana added. Richard turned to her, curious. What choice? To keep moving forward, even when everything and everyone tells us to stop. And in that moment both understood that, though their paths were entirely different, they had crossed at this precise point in life because, somehow, they had chosen the same path, the one of not backing down. In the distance, Lucas ran, or as close as he could get to it, amid the rubble and workers, laughing loudly, freer than perhaps ever before. Richard and Diana watched him, side by side, without needing to say more. 6 months later, the new Freedom Steps Center officially opened its doors. The inauguration was an emotional event, marked not only by the symbolic cutting of the red ribbon, but above all, by the presence of dozens of children and families who, until recently, could scarcely dream of a space where they could be more than patients, where they could simply be themselves. The new center was everything Diana, Zoe, and Dr. Mercer had dreamed of: spacious studios with adapted flooring, physiotherapy rooms integrated with dance spaces, human movement and neuroplasticity research labs, and open areas for interaction, where parents, instructors, and children could exchange experiences and affection without the weight of limiting diagnoses. At the entrance, a wall adorned with photos of the children who had participated in the original project at the old warehouse welcomed visitors. At its center, prominently displayed, was an image of Lucas Montgomery, his face beaming with a smile, balancing with only one splint, symbolizing the spirit of the place, overcoming through freedom. Richard Montgomery was there, of course, but contrary to what many might expect, he didn't give speeches or pose as the protagonist. From the start, he preferred a discreet role, mingling with guests, greeting parents, volunteers, professionals, and above all, watching Lucas interact with other children with an ease that months earlier he himself would never have thought possible. In one of the studios, Lucas rehearsed a short choreography with a group of children for the opening performance, Diana alongside Dr. Mercer watched closely, subtly correcting postures, adjusting sequences, and above all encouraging each child to find their own rhythm. "He hasn't used the right brace in almost a month," Dr. Mercer commented, watching Lucas execute a hesitant but firm spin. "I know," Diana replied with a restrained smile of someone who knows how much each small movement represents a monumental milestone. "And he's more confident," Mercer added. "His expression has changed." "Yes. Now he sees himself as a leader," Mercer nodded, satisfied. "As everyone should." Diana took a deep breath, looking at the room full of children and families. "Remember when no one wanted to fund this?" "I remember," Mercer replied with a hint of irony, "including him." Both glanced at Richard, who, at that moment, was kneeling beside a child, insisting on showing how she could balance with just a rope stretched between 2 bars. "And look at him now," Mercer continued. "Not only funded it, he's present." Diana nodded but chose not to dwell on the comment. She knew Richard's most significant changes weren't the ones everyone could see, but those he quietly struggled to process. Relinquishing control, opening to vulnerability, the ability to follow where he had always insisted on leading. "Diana," Zoe called, rushing over with a tablet in hand. "You need to see this." Diana took the device and saw a notification. An article published that morning in the world's most respected neuroscience journal, co-authored by Dr. Mercer and herself. "You didn't tell me it had already been accepted," she exclaimed, surprised, looking at Mercer. "Wanted it to be a surprise," the neuroscientist replied, with her characteristic calm smile. Diana quickly read the abstract. "The Freedom Steps Method, a revolutionary approach to pediatric motor rehabilitation through autonomy and spontaneous movement. Results indicate significant gains in motor capacity and emotional well-being of participating children." The words seemed unreal. For years, this had been an almost unspoken dream, a hypothesis many experts dismissed as naive idealism. Now, it was science. And more than that, it was a living, concrete, pulsing practice right there before her eyes. "Congratulations," Zoe said, hugging her sister. This is for all the families who never found a place in traditional methods," Diana replied, moved. Zoe nodded, holding back tears. "And now?" she asked after a few seconds. "Now," Diana replied, looking at the room full of dancing children. "Now we keep moving forward. The opening ceremony continued with brief speeches from local representatives, and finally, the children's dance performance, culminating with Lucas at the forefront, leading the movements with confidence as everyone followed. Richard, seated discreetly at the back, watched with teary eyes. Diana approached and sat beside him. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she commented. "More than that," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off his son. "It's true." Diana looked at him, sensing the weight of that word. "And are you okay?" she asked, sincere. Richard smiled, a genuine, calm smile. "Yes, for the first time in years." Diana nodded, satisfied. "And you?" he asked, returning the kindness. "Me too," she replied, looking at the stage where Lucas, now without any support, performed the final movements of the choreography, receiving a warm ovation at the end. The two sat there in silence for a few minutes, just watching, absorbing the scene, allowing themselves to feel what they had long denied, the beauty of the unexpected, the uncontrollable, the spontaneous. When the ceremony ended and families began mingling freely in the space, Diana and Richard were approached by a reporter covering the event. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, "what's it like to see all this today, knowing you were one of those responsible for making it possible?" Richard looked at Diana, then at Lucas, and finally at the reporter. "The feeling," he began, choosing his words carefully, "is that some of the most important decisions we make in life aren't the ones we plan in advance or back with reports, but the ones we make when we simply accept an unexpected invitation." The reporter smiled, satisfied, and thanked him before walking away. Diana looked at Richard, impressed by the naturalness of that response. "You're getting good at this," she teased. "I've been learning from the best," he replied, looking at her. And then, in a simple but deeply symbolic gesture, Richard extended his hand to Diana, as Lucas had done months before, and asked, "Would you dance?" Diana laughed, surprised. "Now?" she asked, looking around, noticing people still mingling, talking, eating. "Why not?" he replied. And right there, in the middle of the room, among children, parents, volunteers, and instructors, the two began to dance, awkwardly, spontaneously, freely, exactly as it always should have been. As they slowly spun, Lucas approached, looking at them with a mischievous smile and asking, "Can I join this dance too?" And in unison they replied, "Of course." And so once again, it all began. The months following the new Freedom Steps inauguration were marked by unexpected expansion, not just physical but philosophical. The method, born out of necessity, a courageous and even desperate attempt by Diana and Zoe to offer an alternative to traditional rehabilitation, became an international reference. Hospitals began requesting partnerships. Universities sent researchers to observe the practical application of an approach that, according to many experts, could revolutionize how the world understood pediatric motor rehabilitation. Diana could barely keep up with the flood of daily requests, invitations to speak, academic collaborations, features in major media outlets. Freedom Steps, which had started with a handful of students in an improvised warehouse, now had a waiting list of over 200 families. And beyond professional success, Diana saw every day the deeper, subtler changes. Families who once felt isolated, children who had never experienced the joy of free movement, parents who found a safe space to trust in their children's potential again. Amid this revolution, Richard Montgomery became a constant but always discreet presence. Where his identity once meant control, command, and absolute decisions, he now found comfort in a far humbler role, that of a silent supporter, providing the resources needed for others to shine. Lucas, meanwhile, progressed in leaps and bounds, literally. He no longer needed the orthopedic brace for most activities, and more impressively, had spontaneously taken on a leadership role among the children, helping younger ones face initial challenges with a patience and empathy that left Richard moved every time he watched. One spring Saturday, as Diana led a free movement workshop, Richard waited in the reception, idly flipping through a progress report on the center, when Zoe approached with 2 coffees. "I can't imagine this place without you anymore," she commented, handing him one of the cups. Richard smiled, accepting the coffee. "Neither can I. And to think, at the beginning, you were the symbol of everything we were fighting against," Zoe teased, with her characteristic sharp humor. Richard let out a genuine laugh. "I was, wasn't I?" Zoe leaned in, resting on the table in front of him. What happened, huh? Richard fell silent for a few seconds, looking through the reception's glass at the studio where Lucas, at that moment, was teaching a movement sequence to a little boy with a prosthetic leg. Then he took a deep breath and answered, "I stopped trying to control." Zoe raised her eyebrows, impressed by the simplicity and depth of that response. "And how'd you manage that?" she asked. Richard shrugged. "I accepted that sometimes. Following is braver than leading." Zoe smiled, satisfied, and raised her coffee cup in a toast. "Welcome to the right side." They both laughed, and in that laughter was the complicity of those who knew they'd overcome barriers far greater than the visible ones. That same afternoon, after the activities ended, Diana invited Richard for a walk through the gardens surrounding the new center. The space was specially designed to provide students with an outdoor movement experience, with gentle ramps, textured paths, and adapted equipment. "All this," Diana began as they walked side by side, "was just an idea in my head one day, while I was serving coffee to rushed executives at the restaurant." "And now?" Richard asked, curious. "Now it's real." He smiled, looking at the path ahead. "You turned the impossible into reality." "No," she corrected. "We did." Richard nodded, acknowledging that it was indeed a collective effort, woven by many hands, many hearts, and above all, many small but decisive steps. "And what's next?" he wanted to know. Diana looked at the horizon, where some children played freely under the sun. "Expand, replicate the model in other cities, other countries. And you think you can do it?" She turned to him, with that confident look that always disarmed him. "After everything we've seen here, how could I doubt?" Richard smiled, but then grew serious. "And you, Mum, have you forgiven?" Diana frowned, not immediately understanding. "For everything," he explained, gesturing vaguely, as if encompassing years of exclusion, prejudice, and closed doors. She took a deep breath, reflecting for a moment. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to carry the weight." Richard nodded, respecting the depth of that response. "And you?" she asked, returning the question. "Have you forgiven yourself?" He fell silent, looking at Lucas, now running, laughing alongside other friends. "I'm trying," he answered finally. "A little each day." Diana placed a hand on his shoulder in a silent gesture of support. A few days later, at an international conference on rehabilitation innovation, Diana was invited to present Freedom Steps as a reference model. The auditorium was packed. Doctors, physiotherapists, educators, investors, and representatives from institutions across various countries waited to hear the story of this program that challenged paradigms and delivered results many considered miraculous. Taking the stage, Diana took a deep breath, looked at the audience, and without relying on charts or statistics, began by telling a story. A little over a year ago, a 10-year-old boy, wearing orthopedic braces and paralyzed by fear, reached out to me and invited me to dance. And I accepted. The audience remained in absolute silence, absorbing every word. In that moment, it wasn't about rehabilitation, movement, or neuroscience. It was about dignity, about the courage of a boy who, despite his limitations, chose to lead. She paused briefly, looking to the back of the auditorium where Richard and Lucas sat, watching with pride. And that's how Freedom Steps began. Not with a big budget or a state-of-the-art lab, but with a simple choice, to accept the invitation to follow the step of someone who, until then, everyone only wanted to lead. At the end of the presentation, the auditorium rose in a standing ovation, celebrating not just the project's success, but, above all, the strength of the idea sustaining it, that freedom isn't granted, it's conquered, and true leadership lies in creating spaces where others can express themselves, take risks, fail, learn, and dance. When Diana stepped off the stage, Lucas immediately hugged her, saying excitedly, "You were amazing," and Richard beside him added, "You changed the world." Diana smiled, looking at both of them. "You did too." And in that silent embrace was the certainty that, no matter how many centers were opened, how many papers published, or awards received, the most important thing had already been achieved. The transformation of lives, relationships, and perspectives. Months after the conference, Freedom Steps had become a true global movement. Programs inspired by the model sprang up worldwide. Rehabilitation clinics in Scandinavia, social projects in Africa, community initiatives in Latin America. The impact was undeniable, and Diana, though now internationally recognized, made a point of maintaining her routine at the original center, firmly believing her mission was not just to expand, but to preserve the essence of what they'd created, a space where every child was seen, heard, and above all, respected in their autonomy. Richard, meanwhile, spent more time than ever at the center. He had learned to set aside the image of the unshakable executive, trading glass-walled office meetings for casual conversations in the cafeteria, walks through the sensory gardens, or simply silent observations of Lucas's and other children's progress. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell gently over the Freedom Steps courtyard, Richard and Diana sat on one of the garden benches, watching Lucas play with other children. He now ran with ease, using only a slight ankle brace, more for safety than necessity. "Remember the first time he tried to stand on his own?" Richard asked, with a nostalgic smile. "I remember," Diana replied, also smiling. "And I remember you wanting to run to him to hold him." Richard laughed. "And you held me back." "Someone had to," she teased, with a tone that mixed humor and tenderness. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched Lucas now helping a younger girl balance on a support bar. "He's become a reference here," Richard commented, with evident pride. "He's become himself," Diana corrected. "No labels, no imposed limitations." Richard nodded, absorbing the depth of that statement. After a few minutes, he turned to her and asked, "Have you ever thought about giving up?" Diana took a deep breath, looking at the horizon. "Many times. When the funding didn't come, when we were rejected, when I saw my sister get sick from dedicating so much. But there was always a child who reached out and invited me to dance, metaphorically or not. And then I remembered why I started." Richard nodded, admiring the clarity and strength of that response. "And you?" Diana asked. "Ever thought about backing out, undoing this support?" Richard laughed softly. "In the first few days, yes. I thought I was getting into something I didn't understand, couldn't control. But then I realized that was always the problem. I thought I needed to control everything. And now," she teased, "now I follow." They both laughed, like old friends who no longer needed many words to understand each other. That same day, during a coordination team meeting, Dr. Mercer presented the latest research results from the program's participants. "The data is impressive," she began, projecting charts and statistics on the screen. "Over 80% of the children showed significant improvements not only in motor capacity, but also in self-esteem, socialization, and academic performance." Everyone in the room applauded, moved. Diana, seated next to Zoe, couldn't contain her pride at seeing what they'd built, not just as a social project, but as a solid, respected, and admired scientific proposal. After the meeting, as she walked through the center's corridors, Diana crossed paths with a newly arrived mother with a 6-year-old child in a wheelchair. The woman seemed nervous, unsure. "Hello," Diana greeted with a warm smile. "First time?" The mother nodded, clutching her daughter's hand. "Don't worry," Diana said, kneeling to be at the child's level. "Here, everyone finds their rhythm." The girl smiled shyly, and the mother breathed a sigh of relief. As she watched them head to their first class, Diana felt again that certainty that had always guided her, that more than techniques, equipment, or funding, what made Freedom Steps special was the welcoming, the respect, and the unwavering belief that every child in their own time could forge their own path. A few days later, Richard invited Diana to dinner outside the center, something they'd never done before. They chose a small restaurant in the neighborhood, far from Manhattan's glamour, where they could talk without interruptions or spotlights. During dinner, they talked about everything: Freedom Steps' journey, the new units being planned in other cities, Lucas's progress, the changes both had lived through in the past year. At one point, Richard fell silent, staring at his wine glass. "I want to apologize," he said finally. Diana frowned, not immediately understanding. "For that night, at the restaurant, when I—" She smiled, interrupting him with a gesture. "You've already done much more than apologize. You transformed your life, your son's, and hundreds of others." Richard smiled, grateful for her generosity, but still insisted, "Even so, I'm sorry for not seeing, for not listening, for not believing." Diana nodded, briefly holding his hand across the table. "You weren't the only one, but you were one of the few who chose to change." He smiled, moved. After dinner, they walked back to the center, where Lucas was participating in a nighttime workshop with other children. Upon arriving, they found the boy sitting in the courtyard, looking at the stars. "Dad! Diana!" he called, waving. They approached and sat beside him on the ground under the starry sky. "I was thinking," Lucas began. "What?" Richard asked. "That when I grow up, I want to be a teacher here." Diana smiled, moved. "You'll be amazing," she said, holding his hand. "You already are," Richard added, looking at his son with overflowing pride. And there, under the silent sky, the three stayed, unhurried, simply enjoying the moment, aware that this story, which began with a simple invitation to dance, had now become a legacy that would continue to impact lives far beyond them. A few weeks after that quiet night under the stars, unexpected news reached Freedom Steps. The program had been nominated for one of the most prestigious International Social Innovation Awards, globally recognized for highlighting initiatives that transform communities through creative and effective solutions. The announcement caused an immediate stir among everyone: children, parents, technical staff, volunteers. The center, already a place of intense activity and hope, now buzzed with the possibility of having its work recognized on the highest stage. When Diana learned of it, she froze for a few minutes, sitting in her small office, holding the printed email in her hands. Zoe walked in, and seeing her sister emotional, asked, "What's wrong?" Diana simply handed her the paper. Zoe read it quickly, and when she finished, let out a joyful scream, hugging her tightly. "We did it! Diana, we did it!" Diana, still stunned, replied with a trembling voice, "We did it, Zoe. We did it." Richard was one of the first to congratulate them in person. He arrived at the center that same day with a bouquet of flowers and a box of chocolates. "Not very original, I know," he joked, handing over the gifts. "You didn't need to," Diana replied, smiling. "I did, yes," he insisted. "You deserve all the honors." Lucas, listening nearby, added, "You guys are the best." Everyone laughed, and the celebratory mood took over the center for days. The award ceremony would take place in Paris, and the event organizers insisted that Diana, Zoe, and a family representative travel to receive the award in person. Richard immediately offered to cover all expenses. "No discussion," he said, when Diana tried to refuse. "Consider it another investment in the future." So a few days later, the trio boarded a flight to France. Diana, Zoe, and Lucas, unanimously chosen as the ideal representative of the families participating in the program. The trip was full of discoveries for Lucas, who had never left the country. He was fascinated by Paris's architecture, tried croissants in small bakeries, and, of course, visited the Eiffel Tower, where he insisted Diana and Zoe take dozens of photos. On the night of the awards, all were elegantly dressed, but none seemed as comfortable in formal attire as Lucas, who proudly wore a custom-made suit paired with a blue tie he'd chosen himself. The event hall was lavish, with crystal chandeliers, red carpets, and perfectly arranged tables. Public figures, social leaders, government representatives, and NGOs were present, all eagerly awaiting the announcement of the night's main award. When the Master of Ceremonies took the stage and began reading the description of the winning project, Diana gripped Zoe's hand tightly. Lucas, beside them, watched with wide eyes. "And the International Social Innovation Award goes to Freedom Steps," the presenter announced, prompting thunderous applause and a standing ovation from the entire auditorium. Diana, stunned, looked at Zoe, who, emotional, already had tears in her eyes. Lucas, without waiting, stood first, pulling both by the hands. "Let's go," he said, smiling. They walked to the stage amid relentless applause, with flashes firing from all sides. The presenter handed Diana the golden trophy, a minimalist sculpture of two bodies in motion, intertwined as if dancing. When asked to say a few words, Diana took a deep breath, holding the microphone firmly. "This award isn't just for me or my sister. It's not just for Freedom Steps. It's for every child labeled a lost cause, for every family told there was nothing more to be done, for every professional who dared to believe there's a different way to walk." She paused, emotional, and then added, "It all started with an invitation to dance, a simple invitation but full of meaning, an invitation to freedom, to dignity, to autonomy." She turned to Lucas, who watched her attentively beside Zoe, and concluded, "And today, I can only say thank you. For every step taken, for every barrier overcome, for every hand extended, this award is for all of us. The auditorium erupted in another round of applause, and as they left the stage, Lucas hugged Diana tightly, saying, "You were incredible," and she replied, "You're the reason for all of this." Back at the hotel, still reeling from the night, the three sat on the room's balcony overlooking the Seine. The atmosphere was calm, intimate, as if after the ceremony's intensity, they needed only silence and each other's presence to celebrate. Diana looked at Lucas, playing with the trophy, and then at Zoe, who smiled, relaxed. "It doesn't even feel real," she commented, almost in a whisper. "It's more than real," Zoe replied. "It's deserved." Diana nodded, moved. The next morning, before the flight back, Richard called, eager for news. "So?" he asked as soon as Diana answered. "We brought the trophy," she replied, smiling. On the other end, Richard let out a joyful exclamation. "I knew it. Congratulations, Diana. Congratulations to all of you." "Thank you, Richard," she replied, sincere. "For believing." "You taught me to believe," he corrected. Back in New York, Freedom Steps held a reception to celebrate the achievement. Families, volunteers, healthcare professionals, all gathered to celebrate. The trophy was placed in a prominent spot at the center's entrance, where everyone could see it as a symbol, not just of institutional victory, but above all, of human triumph. Amid the celebration, Diana made a point of personally thanking everyone who had contributed to that journey, and when she found Richard, she hugged him tightly, saying, "Without you, none of this would have been possible." He, emotional, replied, "Without you, I'd still be just another man trapped in the illusion of control." And as he said this, he looked at Lucas, running among the children, happy, free, whole. In that moment, both knew, without needing words, that the most important thing had already been achieved. Not the award, not the recognition, but the certainty that their lives had been irrevocably transformed. And that, from then on, new dances, new invitations, and new steps would continue to emerge, driven not by the desire to control or lead, but by the courage to follow and trust. A few months after the award celebration, the routine at Freedom Steps continued with its usual cadence of challenges, discoveries, and small daily triumphs. Diana kept leading the workshops, guiding the team, and welcoming new families arriving from all corners, seeking not just treatment, but belonging. The center, now a symbol of transformation, had also become a training hub, offering courses for professionals interested in replicating the method elsewhere. One summer afternoon, as sunlight streamed generously through the main studio's large windows, Lucas called Diana to see something. He was beside a 4-year-old newcomer, trying to balance on a small wooden block. Lucas encouraged her with calm gestures and kind words, until finally the girl managed to stand upright for a few seconds before falling onto the soft mat, laughing. Diana, witnessing the scene, felt a lump in her throat, not just for the child's achievement, but for how Lucas had transformed, from an insecure boy marked by physical and emotional limitations to a young man now inspiring others with his story and presence. Richard, watching discreetly from the door, approached Diana. He's really leading," he commented with quiet pride. Diana nodded. "Yes, and in the most beautiful way possible, not by force, but by example." They stood in silence, watching as Lucas helped the girl try again. "Have you ever thought about what would have happened if that night at the restaurant I'd stopped it all? If I'd told him to sit, ignored his invitation?" Richard asked, with a look mixing reflection and relief. "I think about it sometimes," Diana replied, looking at him. "And I always come to the same conclusion. Thank goodness you didn't." Richard smiled, taking a deep breath as if still processing the impact of that seemingly simple choice that had changed everything. Later that day, Freedom Steps received a group of physiotherapy and special education students eager to learn about the center's operations. Diana led them through the space, explaining each area, sharing the program's philosophy, and of course telling the story that started it all. The unexpected dance between her and Lucas, months earlier, in a Manhattan restaurant. At the end of the tour, one student, visibly moved, asked, "What would you say is the most important thing for someone wanting to work in rehabilitation?" Diana smiled, reflecting for a few seconds before answering, "Respecting each person's time and rhythm, and above all having the humility to follow when invited to dance." The group applauded, and Diana discreetly returned to her office, where she found a letter on her desk. It was from a mother who had recently visited the center with her son, thanking them for the welcome and the renewed hope. Diana read the letter carefully, moved as she always was when realizing the real impact of the work they did there. She tucked it carefully into the drawer where she kept many similar letters, small silent testimonies of the transformation cultivated in that space day after day. On her way out, she crossed paths with Zoe, who was with Lucas, carrying a poster they'd made for the next fundraising campaign. "Look what we made," Lucas said excitedly, showing the colorful poster with the phrase written in big letters, "Every step counts." Diana smiled, emotional, and hugged them both. "That's right, Lucas," she said, looking at him fondly. "Every step counts." At the end of the day, as the children left, the center's lights began to go out, and silence settled over the space. Diana stood in the main studio, looking at the wall where photos marking Freedom Step's journey were displayed, from the first meetings in the old warehouse to the most recent achievements. Richard, seeing her there, approached quietly. "Ready for another week?" he asked, smiling. Diana looked at him, then at the space around them, at all the memories, all the transformed lives, and replied with serenity, "Ready for another dance." And together, they left the studio, aware that as long as there were children reaching out and people willing to follow them, Freedom Steps would continue to pulse, inspire, and transform the world, one step at a time. The end.